Welcome to live stream number 16 of Markna 2023. Our sponsor for the event is Slidelock, who gave us a ton of prizes for the raffle. The raffle right now is sitting at $6,700 raised for Coral Restoration Foundation, and we still have, 8 more hours to go. That's crazy. At some point, I'm just going to pass out, and you guys are just going to have to pull me off this desk and just have someone else talk for a while. But our next speaker is going to be James Fatherree, who I've actually known for several years. He is an author. He loves clams. He loves diving. And I have his clam book from the past. And he's actually got a new one about to drop. It's really exciting. He's also a professor, and he's always talking about his students. And one of the things I appreciate is on his Facebook, he talks about the students trying to get away with stuff, and he lets us know what shenanigans they try to do, and how he doesn't tolerate it at all. But he takes his students on these trips too, and I'm a little jealous. I'd like to go, even though I'm too old to go. I'm not a student. But I'm welcome to Markna. I'm sorry we're an hour later for your presentation, but I'm super glad you stayed up.
That's all right. I'm a night owl anyway. This is about when I would usually be getting ready for bed.
Mm-hmm. Well, now you got to wait a full extra hour.
uh,
So you go on dive trips a lot. It seems like 3 or 4 a year almost. Is that about right?
I try to take at least one big trip every year. Mm-hmm. Somewhere far away, and then I'll usually go a couple of times a year somewhere here in Florida. Mm-hmm. Maybe in the Caribbean, something like that, not too far away.
Yeah. Well, let's go ahead and put your slides up here so you can start doing it, because you said you have so much information we could go for 2 hours. That's a lot of information.
So I could talk for hours and hours.
You're just going to tell that, see, I can literally catch up on some sleep really quick. No, I have to stay awake to move the slides at this point. So I see we're starting off with a bunch of stuff about giant clams.
Yep.
That looks good.
And first, I hate to do it right at the beginning, but I do have to do my shameless plug.
Yeah.
I've been very busy for the last year, really about a year and a half. First of all, I had my giant clams in the Reef Aquarium book that came out in 2019, and I've done a pretty big update to it. I added about 30 pages of new material to it, a lot of new pictures, and so that's out now. Nice. It's only available on Amazon at this time, but it'll be available elsewhere soon enough. I've also written a whole book just called The Giant Clams, which has nothing in it for aquarists. Okay. It has a lot more detail about a lot of the different species we don't see in the hobby. And it's got a lot of trivia, just sort of interesting stuff, a little bit of which I'll talk about tonight. Mm-hmm. But again, it's really not for aquarium people. It's just for anybody. Mm-hmm. It is almost 300 pages, and I've got over 500 photographs in it, though. So if you think giant clams are interesting, you'll like the book. On top of that, like I said, I've been busy. On top of that, I'm still working on it, but I'm making a series of videos about giant clams. It's going to be on identification and biology. So that's going to be on YouTube. I've only got a couple of them done so far, but the rest will come.
Very interesting.
And I also decided, you know what, I'm just going to put all of my giant clam pictures online. So I've got a ton of them in the books, but I've got lots and lots of other ones that didn't make it into either book. So I set up a page on Flickr, which is free, and I just have an album for each of the different species on there. And so if you go to my website, which is jameswfatherree.com, you can find links to the YouTube videos and the free photo albums and the books.
Nice. That's excellent. Okay, guys, don't take a screenshot now. And now we're going to listen to James. Keep going.
All right, and that's it for my plug.
All right. No, that's a great plug. And we could show it again later if you wanted.
All right. And don't really know the audience. I'm always going to assume there's at least some people that might be tuning in to watch this that don't really know much of anything at all about giant clams, might just be curious. So I thought I would just start with some very basic information, some things that are interesting about them, and then go from there. And I do have some stuff later about aquarium care, some specific and good stuff if I'm on that long. But for now, I'll just give you, like I said, just some basic stuff. Yeah. Right now, there are 12 species, and that number has changed. It has gone up and down over time, but for right now, we've got 12 different species of giant clam, and 7 of those are available to hobbyists. 5 of them are not. They're rare, or they're out in the middle of nowhere where just nobody collects or anything like that. We just don't see them. But the 7 common species are right here on the screen. Tridacna crocea, you can get that readily. Maxima is probably the most common by far. Squamosa is very easy to get. Duras is easy to get. Hippopus, you see those sometimes for sale. Gygus is kind of occasional. Those, people get batches of aquacultured ones every once in a while. And Noah used to be really popular in the hobby, but I don't see that many of them anymore. But they're still a common species, and you can probably find one every once in a while for sale if you're looking. Okay. So those are the common ones, and those are like I say, the 2 different books. In one book, I talked about all the species, and the other one that's for the reef aquarists, I really just stick with these 7. And you can go to the next slide. If you don't know much of anything about these at all, just to give you a few basic terms, you've got a shell, which is pretty much like any other clam shell, except usually you see clams sitting like this, with the shell open maybe. Giant clams tend to sit like this with the shell open up. Okay. And that fleshy, sort of colorful, usually colorful, tissue that rises up and kind of usually goes up and out of the shell, that's called the mantle. Or more specifically, that's the upper mantle. Right? Go to the next one. And if you look down on top of the mantle, if you were to look, straight down at one of these clams, you'd see a couple of different openings in that mantle tissue. The one over there on the left that looks kind of like a slot, that's called the inhalant siphon. And the one on the right that looks like a little chimney or a little tube, that's the exhalant siphon. And when these clams are sitting around, it might look like they're not doing much, but they're actually working pretty much all the time. They actually generate their own water flow, and they suck water into that inhalant siphon, and the water passes over their gills and passes around their organs, and then the water goes out of the exhalant siphon. Right? And they can filter feed with their gills. Now, this is how most regular clams make their living. They suck water in. Again, they create their own current. So they suck water in, and that water passes over the gills. The gills are covered with mucus. Tiny little particulates stick to them. And it gets pretty complicated. The gills actually have tiny little sorting grooves in them, and particulate matter, phytoplankton, zooplankton, detritus, and even tiny bits of sand and sponge spicules and all sorts of little things like that. Will stick onto the gills, and then those particles, they get sorted out to some degree. Then they're moved down the gills in these grooves, and they go to basically the clam's mouth. And giant clams, they do actually have a full digestive system. So they've got a mouth, an esophagus, a stomach, and intestines. Right? And so they can feed, but go to the next slide. But for the most part, they don't have to. The most interesting thing about them is that they literally live off light, like corals do. All of these clams, that's the one thing they really have in common that just makes them so special, is that they take in zooxanthellae from the environment. Like when they're filter feeding, they take in a little bit of zooxanthellae with whatever else they eat, but they are somehow able to sort that out. And nobody's really sure how, but they're able to sort that zooxanthellae out, not digest it, and then they take it and they incorporate it into their body. And I'm going to say something about that in just a minute. But they incorporate that into that mantle tissue. And so that's why you'll see the clams, like I said, they're usually sitting up like this, facing the sun, with that mantle tissue up and out. It's just like a big solar panel. So they're trying to get light onto that mantle. The algae inside the mantle is going to get hit with that light, and the algae makes way, way more food than it needs for itself, and the extra goes to the clam. So, as I was saying a minute ago, they really don't have to filter feed for the most part. And in fact, they have been raised under experimental conditions where workers have taken larval clams and raised them in systems with only filtered water. So 0 particulate matter, just to see if they could raise them, and the clams have survived just fine. So, and you can go to the next one. And something else that's unique and this will sound strange, but the algae in this case are actually held in a system of tubes. And the algae are zooxanthellae, so we've got what's called the zooxanthellae tubular system.
Mm-hmm.
The really weird part about it is it's attached to the stomach.
Wow.
So it starts out as a single tube that's attached to the stomach. And so, like I said, the clams, when they filter feed, they can take in some zooxanthellae. They can sort that out from other things they've eaten. And like I said, they can digest other algae and other zooplankton and such. But the zooxanthellae, somehow they're able to take that and they basically feed it into this tube. Again, attached to the stomach.
Mm-hmm.
And that tube then forks, and it forks again, and it forks again. And it spreads up into the mantle.
Yeah.
And it looks almost like a circulatory system.
Yeah.
And if you look at this picture I've got, I did a lot of sort of photoshopping to it to get that to stand out. But you can kind of see what looks like blood vessels going through the mantle of this clam.
Yeah.
But in this case, they're dead ends. In the circulatory system, you've got blood that leaves the heart basically and runs through the arteries and veins back to the heart. In this case, these are dead end tubes. So they just get smaller and smaller and smaller until they end at the edge of the mantle. And so those tubes, they're just packed with this algae. And again, that's how they make a living. Mm-hmm. And I'll say something more about it in just a little bit, but I'll hold off on that. So let's go to the next one.
All right.
The other thing they can do is absorb nutrients directly from seawater. These are electron microscope pictures of the mantle. So again, if we look at it really closely, you realize it's not as smooth as it might look with your eye. Mm-hmm. It's got all these millions and millions of little fingers on it. And I'm going to see if I can say this right. Microvillus pinocytosing epidermal layer. Wow. I think I got it. Lots of these little fingers, and of course those things are there to increase surface area. And they're very good at sucking nutrients directly from seawater. And so giant clams, they can suck ammonia and nitrate and phosphates straight out of the water.
Wow.
And that's also one of the reasons that they can go without doing any filter feed. Now, they would need those nutrients under any circumstances, but instead of getting it from eating plankton, they can just suck it out of the water. Mm-hmm. Right? And I should mention, too, I said something about an experiment where they were raised from larvae in filtered water, but that water did have dissolved nutrients in it, just no particulate matter.
Okay. It looks like carpet to me, like the fabric with the carpet.
It does, but believe it or not, those are actually, as far as I understand it, those are actually cells.
Wow. That's interesting.
Lots and lots of them. You might remember, maybe somebody remember from like high school biology when you talk about the small intestine. Mm-hmm. On the inside of the small intestine, you have the villi, and it's villous. In other words, it's got lots of fingers on the inside that increase surface area. So same basic idea.
Huh. Okay.
What else have we got here? Let's keep going.
Okay.
Something else interesting about giant clams. They do have eyes, and they can see you coming, which gets really annoying when you're trying to take pictures of them lots of times.
Right.
They're not very fancy. Now, giant clams, they do have gills. They've got, I told you, they've got an esophagus, a stomach. They've got intestines. They've got kidneys. They've got muscles that open and close the shell. They've got gonads. They've got eyes. They don't have a brain, though, which is kind of odd. They don't have any sort of a brain whatsoever. They've got plenty of nerves, and they've got 4 sort of nerve bundles that aren't really brains, but they're called ganglia. They've got 4 of these things, and they're attached to a bunch of these eyes. So they don't really make like a picture. They don't work like our eyes do. But they can pick up changes in light. They can pick up shadows.
Yeah.
If something moves over a clam, especially sometimes just next to a clam, they'll see it and they'll react to it. Lots of times they'll kind of close up the shell if they think it's a threat. And lots of times these eyes, they're just tiny, tiny little spots, like you can see here where the arrows are. Go to the next slide. And sometimes there's more of them, and sometimes they've got little holes, and sometimes they look like little lumps, so they're not all the same. They kind of vary from species to species a lot. And go one more slide. And sometimes they're pretty fancy looking.
Yeah.
I mean, these little things are called papillae. So sometimes you see these little stalks or buds or little lumps, and those have eyes on them too. And again, sometimes these clams they might have hundreds or even thousands of these little simple eyes. And I did stick in the one video, which you can play now, just to show you what it's like if you swim over one.
Okay.
And this was a big maxima in the Red Sea.
Hmm.
And so you can see they'll react to anything that they think might be a threat. That one actually was pretty big and did not close up its shell. But I'll tell you, lots of small ones, the minute they see something, they just close that shell up tightly. And I'm saying a minute ago, it can be very frustrating because these can be difficult to photograph.
Yeah, exactly.
Because a lot of times they'll snatch shut like that, and then you want to get a good picture, you know, if it was an awesome clam, and then you just have to sit there and wait. And be still, stay a few feet away, and just wait and wait and wait, which sometimes is not really an option when you're diving. But,
And don't make another shadow.
yeah, and don't make another shadow. We keep going with things that are interesting.
Mm-hmm.
This has been figured out relatively recently. For a long time, people thought that the algae made pigments, so you had the zooxanthellae pigments, but that the clams also made pigments too. So they've got all these crazy colors sometimes, from black to white and everything in between. So they thought it was some sort of pigment that the clam was making. Researchers were also aware of these specialized cells called iridocytes that had reflectors in them. But really, in the last few years, they've sort of figured out that these colors, like you see in this picture, they're not from pigments made by the clam. They're from these little reflective cells. And these things, there's, again, an electron microscope picture of one on the left.
Yeah.
Take a look. These cells, they're filled with these tiny little crystals that are stacked in these layers like this, and the distance between the crystals, the distance between the layers, is variable. Somehow these things are able to basically change the distance between these crystals, and then when light comes in and hits these, some of it reflects back out as a different color.
Wow.
And somehow that distance, that spacing in between those crystals creates a shift in the color. And what they figured out is that some of the light hits these cells in the mantle, bounces back off, and of course you see whatever got reflected. What doesn't get reflected, or some other colors, actually get sent forward through the cell. So you have what's called backscattering, which is what comes back at you, and that's what you see. But you also have forward scattering into the mantle.
Wow.
So it's kind of neat. The sunlight can hit one of these things, and then it sends some of that light forward, scatters it into the mantle where it hits some of the algal cells.
Yeah.
So they're almost like little light intensifiers.
Yeah.
And the mantle has millions and millions of these cells in it. And again, they come in different colors. And when you start mixing these different colors you get all sorts of different looks on the mantles of these clams. And nobody's really sure why they have all the crazy patterns or why they can look so different. Even you can have a lot of clams even from the same parents, and they can look totally different. Some can just be brown, not very pretty at all, and the other ones are absolutely gorgeous with all sorts of colors on them. And again, that part's kind of still a mystery, but at least they figured out like where the colors themselves actually come from.
Mm-hmm.
Next, what else we got? Also interesting.
Mm-hmm.
When they're small, they're no-sex. But after a while, like for some of them it takes about a year, for some of them it's 4 or 5 years, they will slowly develop gonads. And they'll develop testes first, and they'll start making sperm. Mm-hmm. So they go from having no sex to being male. Once they become male, they can start to spawn. And that's what you've got here. You've got a picture of a big one that's spawning and blowing out puffs of sperm out of its exhalant siphon.
Right.
So the shell will contract real hard like this, and they just squirt these, again, clouds of sperm out. Mm-hmm. And they are spawners. So, other clams are around, and some clams squirts out eggs, and some clams squirts out sperm, and, with the hopes that some of them are going to meet and become fertilized and turn into the next generation of clams.
Right.
But the neat thing is, like I say, at first they're male. But then later they can also become female. So again, it might take a year or 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 years, depending on the species, to turn male, and then it can take up to another 5 years to become female.
Yeah.
And the thing is, they stay both sexes at the same time. They don't turn male. I might have said that wrong. They don't turn male and then turn into female. They become male and female at the same time. So they'll have testes and ovaries.
Wow.
And so after a few years, when they spawn, they'll start to blow out the sperm for a while. And then when they've kind of become spent, they'll stop. And then they'll start to squirt out clouds of eggs.
That's crazy. I can't believe that's real.
It's like I say, it's different. So
yeah.
They'll do that. The remarkable thing to me is some of these clams, it takes them 10 years to become fully mature.
Mm-hmm.
So when you see it, you just think, yeah, it's just some clam. If it's actually spawning and putting out eggs, that clam might be, 10 years old before it can start doing that. Let's take a look at the next one.
Sure.
All right. On top of that, now this part might seem kind of obvious. They're not all the same. Now, since there's 12 different species, and we're going to say a little bit about their differences. Mm-hmm. If you look down at the bottom right of this picture, you can see Tridacna crocea. Mm-hmm. And my name is kind of covering it up, but it says 12-year-old crocea. So you see that clam at the bottom right is 12 years old. And then you look at the other two, the one over on the left, that's a squamosa. The one at the top right is a durasa. Mm-hmm. Those clams are both 5 years old. So you can see that they have dramatically different growth rates. Crocea grows very slowly. And I'll tell you that little 12-year-old crocea down there, that's about as big as they get. So even though they're called giant clams, those are not very giant. Mm-hmm. About 6 inches. That's in fact, the record is about 6 inches. So most of them, if you look at them, a 4 or 5 inch clam, that would be considered a big crocea. Mm-hmm. You look at some of these other ones like squamosa and durasa, those things will get up to 20 or maybe 24 inches, depending on the species. But those would be record size. Mm-hmm. Again, if I say it can get up to 24 inches, I mean, that'd be like an NBA player. That'd be like a person making it to 7 feet. It doesn't mean there's lots of 2-foot durasas sitting around. Most of them will stay significantly smaller than that, but they can get up to a couple of feet. On the other hand, you got Tridacna gigas, which is like the real giant clam. Like if you think of the giant clam.
Yeah.
The record gigas is about 4.5 feet.
That's really big.
Huge. And several hundred pounds, obviously. So you've got gigas is the biggest one. It's about 4.5 feet, and then you've got durasa and squamosa, and again they get up to a couple of feet. So gigas, the record gigas is more than twice as big as the record durasa or squamosa.
Yeah.
And their growth rates pretty much go along with their maximum size. Okay. Again, that crocea, I said they stay really small, for a giant clam, and they grow really, really slow. Even though they stay small, it takes them forever to get that big, as you can see here. Whereas squamosa and durasa, they grow a lot faster and they get a lot bigger, and gigas grows faster than any of them and gets even bigger. Right?
We had
Go ahead to the.
We had a guy his name was Rick. He was a club member. He had a crocea that I think was 2 feet across. And the one on the top right is a crocea, right?
Oh, that's a durasa at the top.
Oh, durasa.
Right.
Yeah, it was 2 feet inside. It was the size of a basketball or a little bit bigger. And he could not keep up with the kalkwasser and the calcium reactor for that clam. The clam was just this giant magnet of absorption to grow, and I think something horrible happened, or the tank leaked or something. And when he did have to remove this clam, whether it died or he removed it finally because it's so ginormous, he probably had like a 125, aquarium. He could not get his water parameters straight because the clam had like balanced everything out for so long that without the clam, he couldn't get his parameters in check because he needed that sponge that just absorbed all the stuff exactly right. It was the craziest thing ever.
Well, to jump ahead just a little bit about aquarium here, that is one of the problems of having a really big one.
Yeah.
That shell, when they grow, not only does the shell just get bigger and bigger, it gets thicker and thicker too.
Sure.
A lot of these things, if you pick up a clam this big around, the top of the shell is actually pretty thin, but then
Yeah.
it gets thicker and thicker and thicker. And by the time you get down to the bottom, again, a clam this big, the shell might be that thick at the bottom.
It's wild.
And it's not like coral skeleton either.
Right.
Coral skeleton is usually really lightweight, kind of porous. It's not particularly dense, and you can take, most of it, just break it off with your hands with your fingers. A clam shell, that stuff is hard and dense. It's very, very strong, which tells you it's got a whole lot of calcium in it. So they do suck up that calcium and that alkalinity very, very quickly.
Yeah.
And again, like in a home-size aquarium, trying to keep one of those really big clams like that, I can see where that would be very, very difficult to keep up.
I'm sure he had it when he was young, and it just got bigger, and it became this monster in his tank. I remember
it happens.
We would always say, "That's crazy. How did you get that in there?" Because it grew into the tank.
Mm-hmm. Well, he was doing a good job.
Yeah.
What else we got here? Oh, I got my next slide.
Yeah.
Something else to show you. Now, I said those different species, they get to different maximum sizes and they grow at dramatically different rates. And now that's different species I'm talking about. Also, if we look within a species, there's lots of variability there too. Now, of course, a bunch of different clams of the same species can look really, really different. They grow at very different rates too, which is something that really surprised me when I first sort of figured this out. If you go to some of these aquaculture facilities where they raise these things, you can see all kinds of neat stuff. And this picture was one of my favorites from a trip I took to one. All three of these clams are croceas, and they're all from the same parents, and they're all the same age. They were made on these clam farms. They'll take the clams and they can basically sort of force them to spawn. So they'll take them and collect the eggs from one, and they collect the eggs from another one, just in buckets usually. They can mix that stuff together and create a bunch of larvae and then try to raise those. And so again, these clams came from the same two parents, same age, raised under the same conditions in the same outdoor tank. And you can see that the small one is less than half the size of the big one, and the other one is kind of in the middle.
Yeah.
So again, even coming from the same parents and living under the same environmental conditions, one of these clams grew more than twice as fast as its sibling.
Yeah.
It's also kind of interesting. It's not what I would have expected. At least not that kind of dramatic difference. And I'll come back to that and why it's important in just a few minutes too.
Okay.
So those are just some things that again, I think are interesting about giant clams. They are unusual organisms for sure. They're not like regular clams, and they're not just something pretty you can stick in a tank.
Yeah.
I mean, you can. They're interesting.
Yeah.
Much more so than I would have ever thought when I first started to sort of get into them. And with that said, like I said, the second half of this, I actually got some information for aquarists instead of just general information about the clams. So.
Yeah.
And there you go. There's my tank from a few years ago.
Oh, nice. Okay, I didn't know whose tank it was. That's nice. I like it.
So that's my big Durasa right there in the middle that you can see.
You did a nice job keeping the middle nice and clear and not cluttered up.
I thought I'd try something different. I don't know if you'd know this. I lived in Japan. I taught English over there from 2003 to 2005, and so I got to see a lot of Japanese reef aquariums.
Yeah.
And again, that was 20 years ago now. It's hard to believe how time passes by so quickly. But 20 years ago, here, some people had gotten into, or I should say, they had gotten away from the rock wall. And that was a big thing in Japan, too. Here, people tend to have the live rock. Well, I know you know what I'm talking about. Like back in the day when everybody just stacked live rock from the bottom to the top and it sloped back and it was just the rock wall. And then when I went over to Japan, I saw a lot of tanks like this. Yeah. Like with little islands and bombs and stuff. And so I brought that back with that idea of setting up a tank like this.
Yeah.
Anyhow, let's go to the next slide.
Okay.
They do need a lot of light, and I wanted to bring up a couple of like the most important things I would tell an aquarist about these. One of the biggest mistakes I think that a lot of reef keepers make is having healthy coral growth and thinking that means you've got enough light for a giant clam.
Yeah. Wow.
And that's not always the case.
Yeah, I'm looking at your numbers. Wow.
Well, and here's the thing: like, if you think of a coral sitting in a tank or in the
Mm-hmm.
sea, there's not a whole lot going on.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, really, when you think about coral polyps, there's not much to them.
Mm-hmm.
And for the most part, they're just sitting there soaking up some sunlight and living off of their own zooxanthellae.
Yeah.
On the other hand, when a clam, like I said earlier, when a clam is sitting on the bottom, it's just sitting there. It doesn't really look like it's doing anything, but there's actually a lot going on.
Yeah.
Because, again, it's got all those guts. I don't know if I mentioned it earlier, but they actually do have a heart, a chambered heart. So they've got a heart that's beating all the time.
I didn't know that. Okay.
Their gills are covered with cilia, which are just tiny, tiny little microscopic hairs, like millions of these little cilia. And those things, they sort of beat rhythmically. That's how they generate the currents that bring the water in over the gills.
Okay.
So again, even though it's just sitting there, there's a lot going on inside of a clam.
Yeah.
They're burning calories. So even just sitting there, that clam is using a lot of calories every day.
Right.
And again, what I'm getting at is you can have plenty enough light to keep a lot of corals alive.
Yeah.
That does not mean you can keep a giant clam alive.
Yeah.
And if you take now this is from years ago,
Yeah.
when I was doing a bunch of research for my other book,
Yeah.
got one of these old light meters and went around and took lots of readings. Anywhere I could, basically.
Sure.
And I have my little, I have a little sensor on a stick, and I can stick it down in there right next to a clam and check the light, stick it right next to this coral. And so these numbers, not to number somebody to death, but these are some of the numbers I came up with.
Yeah.
On the left, you can see quite a few stony corals.
Right. Correct.
Do I even have? Those are all stony corals.
Yeah.
And you can see that quite a few of them. And by the way, I should say the requirement was that you had to be growing.
Yeah.
So anything I checked, it had to be in the tank for at least a few months, and it had to show active growth.
Yeah.
Otherwise, it wasn't interested. So all of these corals you see here, those are the numbers I got.
Yeah.
And all of those were growing under that much light.
Yeah. And it's all like 110 or less par. That's crazy.
Yeah, and so and of course some corals need a lot more than that.
Sure.
But these are examples of corals that were, I should say, that they can live under that little bit of light, and they were.
Yeah.
And if you get into soft corals and mushrooms and things like that, a lot of those can live under even less.
Right. Of course.
Now, when it came to clams, I started measuring. Like, all right, let's go look at clams that again have been in an aquarium for at least several months.
Yeah.
And are showing active growth. I want to see new shell material being added on there. If you just got it a couple of months ago, didn't count.
Yeah.
It took lots and lots of light readings, and basically what I ended up doing is I hate giving numbers, but I basically looked at like, okay, let me get sort of an average number for each species as to what seems to be the minimum light that it can live under.
Yeah.
Then I just added a little bit to that. I made basically what I call like conservative recommendations.
Yep.
And so as I put on here, these are minimums.
Yeah. And they're double what the SPS needed.
Yeah. At least. And if you look at Crocea, 325.
Yeah.
Right now or later, there's going to be somebody saying like, no way, I've got a Crocea under 200 or something like that. And sure, maybe you do.
Yeah.
That's why I brought up some of that stuff about how they're not all the same.
Yeah.
Now, I'm going to tell you, it's what I've figured out. You've got a whole bunch of these clams, and even if they're the same species, even if they're the same age, even if they're from the same parents, that does not mean they can all live under the same amount of minimum amount of light.
Yeah.
I might go to the store and buy 5 Durasas, and if you put them all in a tank, that's only getting like 150 par.
Yeah.
4 of them might die, but 1 of them lives.
Yeah.
Why did that one live? Don't know. For whatever reason, that one was tougher, or something about it made it able to survive under less light than its siblings.
Yeah.
So when it comes to making recommendations, I'm trying to be sort of, again, kind of conservative about it and just say like, look, I'm not saying no Tridacna crocea can survive under less than 325.
Right.
I'm almost sure some of them can. But if you're
Not
going to
all
go
of
buy one and spend the money on it, bring it home, I would not try to keep it under less than 325. I think that's like a safe minimum number.
Yeah.
And same thing for these other ones.
Mm-hmm.
You see the Durasa, Gigas, and Squamosa. Now, those are the three big ones that grow fast.
Yeah.
It's kind of odd that the three really big ones that can grow the fastest also need the least amount of light.
And the hippopus, I'm sure I'm saying it wrong.
Yeah, hippopus.
We've always called them hippo. Those had the least mantle, right? If I remember correctly.
That's true.
Yeah.
Whether you look at all the rest of them, and the mantle tends to come up and out of the shell to some degree, sometimes a lot, sometimes a little.
Yeah.
Hippopus, you're right. That's one of the species where the mantle only comes up just to the edge of the shell and stops.
To the lip,
It does
right.
does not hang over the top.
Yeah.
One of the things they do, though, their hinge is a little different on the shell, and they can open up really, really wide like this.
All right.
More so than some of the other clams.
Yeah. So listen, back at my first Machina, as you probably know, was 2002. Joy from, I think it was Harbor something. Harbor. My brain's saying Harbor Freight. I'm so tired.
That's on Harbor Freight.
Harbor
Aquatics?
Harbor Aquatics. Yeah, remember Joy Meadows? Yeah.
Yeah.
So I'm there at Machina. I've got my little 29-gallon aquarium. I have my Power Compact light bulbs. And I said, and I'm looking at all these beautiful things, like, I want this. And she goes, you can't have any SPS. I'm like, there's got to be something in this tank I can have. Show me one coral I can get. Because everyone's buying stuff, and I felt so left out. So she said, okay, you can have this pink Bacillopora. I said, okay. I said, and I want that clam. And she said, you can't have a clam. And I was like, that beautiful peacock blue Maxima, I didn't know what it was until she told me. I said, that one, I want that. And she says, it'll never survive under your Power Compacts. And I was like, I gotta have it. I gotta try. I gotta try this. So she sold it to me, but she was not proud of me at all. She was more like, okay, and she bagged it up, I drove home because I went home each day from Machina because it was here in Fort Worth. That was my first one. And so I could go to the event and then drive home, put my stuff in the tank. And I put my Bacillopora nice up high, and I tried the clam on the rock, but it jumped off. And it went down to the substrate, which was crushed coral. And that thing was probably 2 inches when I bought it. And I had it for about 5 years. It grew to be almost 5 inches wide under 2 Power Compact bulbs. I mean, it's a shorter tank, 18 inches or whatever, But it was, and everyone's like, only Mark could grow a Maxima under Power Compacts. Like, I didn't think it was that hard. I just fed the tank. So, like you said, I got one lucky clam. It just happened to find one lucky guy. We had a great relationship. And then when I finally got my 280 with metal halides and I moved it over, it died. It didn't like... it did great under Power Compacts, and I finally gave it the official light you're supposed to give it. And I lost it. But that was a really cool clam.
That's a common story. Yeah. And like I say, I can't say I'm surprised.
Yeah.
But, years ago, I used to actually spend a fair amount of time online in the forums. And I'll tell you, Mark, you probably know how this goes. If you say anything, like if I put one of these numbers on there, there's always going to be somebody that chimes in and says, no, you're wrong. You don't know what you're talking about. I've got one that I've had for 17 years and it's fine under, some
under
bright white fluorescent tube they got from the kitchen, or something like that. It's like, well, that's a miracle.
From Harbor Freight.
And I say, like, look, if you had bought 10 clams that day and put all 10 of them under those same lights, maybe 8 of them would have died and 2 of them would have lived.
Right.
Maybe none of them would have lived. Maybe all of them would have lived. You just don't really know. And again, that's why I've tried to make some conservative recommendations for what I consider the minimum.
Yeah. No, this is really interesting stuff. I love it.
And again, you brought it up too. You did have a really shallow tank.
I did.
So
a very
of course
short
that makes
tank.
that makes a big difference too.
Yeah. Next slide.
Yeah, in here. Let's go to that next slide. How are we doing? What time is it? Let's see. Should they be fed in an aquarium? Oh, that was a really big question 20 years ago. Although I still see it pop up, and I was reading something probably a month ago where somebody was talking about the 3-inch rule. And I just thought, like, I thought that was dead 15 years ago, but I guess not. For a while there, back, I guess early 2000s in particular, there were a lot of people that started talking about how you had to feed you had to feed giant clams if you were going to keep them in an aquarium, or they would starve to death. There was stuff in magazines, there was stuff online, and somehow this just all got snowballed into this sort of myth, which is absolutely not true. That if you don't feed giant clams with phytoplankton in an aquarium, they will die. Which the funny thing was, I started reading that and hearing it about how, like, you have to feed them phytoplankton, and I had already had a clam for about 10 years. I think the first time I heard that, and I'd never fed it anything.
That's what you're going to say. You never used phyto in your life?
No.
Wow. Okay.
In fact, I had giant clams before there was phyto. I think, like, DT's phytoplankton, I think, was maybe the first live plankton in a bottle, I believe.
That sounds right.
And I could be wrong, but I think that came out in 96.
Okay.
I think.
Yeah.
Somewhere in the mid-90s.
That sounds right.
Like, I had my first giant clam, I believe, in 91.
Wow.
I've been in the hobby for a while.
What lights did you have back then? Did you have power compacts?
I had halides.
Halides,
that was back when you had to get the halides. And those old, what were they called? Those old URI actinic fluorescents.
I didn't realize that they had halides in 91. Okay.
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
You know what? They had halides in 91, but they didn't have the really good ones.
Yeah. They had the 6,500 Kelvin ones, right? The yellow ones?
Oh, I don't even know if they had 6,500s yet. I think it was 50. I think I had 5,500s, or you could get like 4,700s.
Yeah.
So you had to get those. That's why you had to get the actinic fluorescence
to fix the color. Yes.
But yeah, pretty quickly I had a big tank. Way back when I got hooked, big time.
Yeah. Clearly, you're still talking about them.
Yeah, back there in the early 90s.
Yeah.
Anyhow, let me get back to the question.
Sure.
Should they be fed in aquariums?
Yeah.
You can feed them. Definitely not going to hurt them. Of course, overfeeding a tank under any circumstances is bad. You're going to get hair algae, and it's going to wreck your tank if you're dumping stuff in all the time. But just pouring some in your tank, it's definitely not going to hurt them. And they might even eat some stuff if you give it to them. They might take some plankton in. But I can almost guarantee, as long as you've got sufficient light, there's no need to feed them. You don't need to. It's not any kind of requirement, and I don't care how many places you hear it or see that you might need to feed them in an aquarium to keep them alive. That is not true. Again, people have tested this, under experimental conditions, growing them from larvae into juvenile clams in filtered seawater with no particulate food whatsoever. And then one of the other myths that sort of was going around back then was that something about how when they were really small, they didn't have that much zooxanthellae yet. Because remember, they have to filter feed it basically from the environment. Right. They're not born with it. It doesn't come from their parents. They've got to get their own zooxanthellae. And so this idea was that when they're really small, they don't have much zooxanthellae yet. So they couldn't live off the light, and so they had to have plankton and as a supplement to what they were getting from the light. And then it was called the 3-inch rule, or I call it the 3-inch myth, because the idea was that once they got up to about 3 inches long, that's when they would have enough zooxanthellae to be able to just live off the light. I have no idea where that came from, but no part of that is true. No, I don't even know what to say. No part of that is true. That's nonsense. Plus, the clams, I just showed you all those different growth rates and sizes. There's a big difference in a 3-inch crocea and a 3-inch gigas. Like a 3-inch crocea might be sexually mature, and a 3-inch gigas might be like 2 years old, not even close to it. So this idea that somehow these different clams all become self-sufficient once they hit 3 inches, that's just nonsense. That's enough of that. So no, you don't have to feed them in an aquarium.
Okay.
You remember I said that if as long as you got plenty of light, as long as you get good water quality, and what else do we have in aquariums? Lots of detritus. They do eat detritus.
Mm-hmm.
They can filter that stuff. And of course, we've got no shortage of detritus in our tanks.
Yeah.
I think none of us. So no need to add anything extra.
Sorry about that.
Let's skip go to the next slide.
All right.
Let's just skip that when I'm looking at the clock.
Okay.
Here's a good one.
Yep.
If you've got sufficient light and you've got good water quality, and they can suck up a little detritus. Remember, they can also absorb some of your ammonia and nitrate and some phosphate, which if you've got fish and you're putting fish food in, you've got all that in your aquarium. As long as all that stuff's going on, the zooxanthellae inside the clams will reproduce inside that zooxanthellae tubular system. And the zooxanthellae can reproduce inside a healthy clam so fast that they start sort of getting backed up into the stomach. Remember I said that tube is ultimately connected to the stomach.
Yes.
The tubes will get so filled with zooxanthellae that the zooxanthellae start moving into the stomach, and then the clams just poop them out. Mm-hmm. So it goes right through the stomach, right through their intestines, right out the exhalant siphon, undigested. And the crazy thing is that zooxanthellae, when it comes out, a lot of it's still alive and it's still viable.
Oh, wow. I didn't know that.
Yeah, so it can be taken up by corals or other clams or anything else around that's looking for some zooxanthellae. Mm-hmm. And if you take a look at these two pictures, you see those things that look like little ropes or little hairs coming out. Mm-hmm. Those are coming out of their exhalant siphons.
Right.
That one on the right in particular is super thin. It looks like there's a hair coming out of it or something. Mm-hmm. That's actually a strand of live zooxanthellae and mucus.
Yeah.
And again, it's just getting rid of excess, trying
it's
to get it out of it.
Yeah.
It's actually too much.
Yeah.
And so I wanted to put this in here because hobbyists on occasion will see something like that and think like, oh my God, there's something wrong with the clam.
Right.
There's this goop coming out. Sometimes it's little globs. No, that's a sign of excellent health. That more than likely means everything is going well if you're seeing that. That means the zooxanthellae are getting enough light that not only are they keeping the clam alive but reproducing. So that's a good sign. Mm-hmm. And I'll add this in. Both of those pictures are in aquariums too. So that's not
they are.
Okay. They're under sunlight. That's just in reef aquariums. Giant clams doing well.
Right.
Let's go to the next one.
Okay.
I'm going to hustle through a little bit more. Two more things I'm going to get through quick.
All right.
The two biggest killers of giant clams. Mm-hmm. Pinched mantle.
Yep.
Now, this is an infection by a protozoan. It's really weird because it seemed like nobody had ever heard of it, and then it was all over the place, like in the hobby.
Yep.
And then it seemed kind of like it went away, and it just wasn't a problem anymore. And then every once in a while, you sort of hear about it coming back.
Yeah.
So I don't know if maybe like certain farms or certain suppliers were having troubles, and that stuff was just getting into the sort of the market stream.
Yeah.
But it has killed a whole lot of clams over the years.
Yes.
And what happens is this protozoan gets on the clams, and it looks like the edges of the mantle. Well, it's called pinched mantle. The edges of the mantle, they tend to sort of roll over like this, or they have little pinches in them. Mm-hmm. And it'll look like the clam is trying to stretch its mantle out normally, but it just can't.
Yeah.
Let's go to the next slide.
Okay.
There's three more examples of clams that have pinched mantle. Mm-hmm. And again, you can see how the edge of the mantle is kind of rolled up a little bit.
It's wrinkled, yeah.
It's sort of contorted.
Yeah.
So it's pretty easy to spot. Mm-hmm. Nicely enough, a freshwater dip is usually really effective. Oh, I didn't mention it. It's 100% fatal. I mean, I've never heard of a clam really getting it and showing symptoms like this and then coming back without some kind of treatment.
Yeah.
So if you see a clam and you're pretty sure it's pinched mantle, you have to do something.
Yeah.
It's also highly contagious. So if you've got any other clams, they'll get it if they're in the same system. I shouldn't say they will. They probably will, or they definitely can get it.
Yeah.
But if you take a clam out of the tank, put it in a bowl of fresh water, it's best to match the temperature. It's best to match the pH with a little buffer if you need to.
Yep.
But you can put one of these clams in a bowl of fresh water for 30 minutes. It's no problem.
Unbelievable, right? 30 minutes. Wow.
They can stay in fresh water for hours.
I didn't know that. Okay.
I'm not saying they would like it for hours, but they can survive it. I actually talked to one guy that put a bunch of them in a bucket and forgot about them for hours, and they all lived.
Wow.
There are a lot of them that live in the intertidal zone, so they're exposed to air at low tide.
Yeah.
That means they get rained on.
Yeah.
It's going to happen. So every once in a while, they're just out there in the air, and they're just getting rained on. And of course, you got tropical heat, so they can be pretty tough.
Okay. I've done the 15-minute freshwater dip, and I, like you said, temperature and pH I matched, or I recommend that to others. I've never heard of 30 minutes or longer, or like you said, but
I do 30 minutes. Shake that thing really good. Make sure that fresh water gets all up in there. Sometimes you need a retreat. I would wait several days and see if it looks like there's still any kind of problem. So sometimes it might take 2 treatments. It might take 3. Probably not, but maybe. But I'm telling you, that freshwater dip, it's cheap and effective.
Yeah.
Right. And if you try a freshwater dip and the clam dies, that clam was probably on the way out anyway.
Yeah, a lot of times it seems like once the disease hits, I mean, by the time you're noticing it, it's almost too late already.
The dip is not what killed the clam.
Right.
And you're right. So it was on the way out already.
Yeah.
And let's get in one more.
Okay.
One last one. Pyram snails.
Yep.
Same thing. It seems like for a while, everybody was talking about Pyram snails. And like they were coming, they kind of got in the supply chain.
Right.
Lots of people were having problems with them, and then they kind of go away. Just don't hear about them, and then they kind of come back. Don't know. What I know is these things are tiny.
Yeah.
The biggest ones are about 7 millimeters, something like that. Small ones only get up to like 2 or 3 millimeters, and that's full size.
Yeah.
They tend to live in the sand bed under a clam or attached to the underside of the clam during the day. At night, they'll come out, they'll crawl up the shell. They've got a weird little elephant trunk that sticks out, and they'll poke it right into the clam's tissues and suck the clam's blood. So
I heard they can drill through the shell too, like up high. They can go through. Is that true?
That's a different snail, but yes, there is a snail that'll drill holes right through the shell.
Wow.
These things, they just suck blood, and again, they're tiny.
Yeah.
They do have natural predators. There are quite a few wrasses that'll eat them, that pick them. But in a tank with no natural predators, they can reproduce, and they can just overwhelm a clam. Like out in the wild, if you were to go around and look, you'd find a lot of clams that have a few of these on them. But it's not any big deal as long as they're in low numbers. In a captive system, these little things, they're hermaphrodites. They can have babies all by themselves. They can lay these little kind of about that big, these little gelatinous egg masses. It's like a little glob of mucus filled with eggs. There can be over 100 eggs in one of these little globs, and then a few days later, you've got 100 snails.
Right.
No natural predators. And then those can start to reproduce. And I mean, you could potentially have thousands of these things in your tank relatively quickly. And, again, when you get too many of them, they'll just suck clams dry until they're dead. Let's go to the next slide.
The nice thing is you can just pick these guys off with like a toothpick or something. There you go.
There you go.
I'll shut up. Sorry about that.
Well, you say like the freshwater dip. I saw that previous talk with all the medications and stuff like that, trying to figure all that out.
Right.
At least in this case, look, you got the freshwater dip works really well for the pinched mantle, and for these snails, you just scrub them off.
Right.
Don't put anything in the tank or anything crazy like that.
Just pick them off. Yeah.
Very carefully inspect any clam you buy before it goes in the tank. And, and as people were talking about earlier tonight, it's good to have quarantine.
Right.
It's always good to have quarantine.
Yeah.
But even if you have quarantine or if you don't, scrub that thing down. And again, those gelatinous egg masses are kind of clear and they're hard to see.
Yeah.
So I would scrub that shell down as best as you can, even if you don't see any snails on it.
Yeah.
And last thing I'll say is, the snails that do suck their blood, they're obligate. Which means if you take let's say if you had several clams in a tank, and you find out you got these Pyram snails in there. If you take all the clams out and put them somewhere else for a while, like for 30 days, I know it'd be a pain, but if you put them somewhere else for 30 days, any snails living in the tank will starve to death.
Right. Yeah, because they need the clams.
Yeah, they can't just go suck blood from something else. So they will starve to death, and then you're kind of starting from scratch with a clean tank.
Nice.
So that's also good.
Yeah.
And that's it. I squeezed all that in
That's awesome.
right
Thank
at
you
about
so
an
much.
hour.
That was really, really interesting. I don't know. I learned way more during this talk than I expected. You actually covered a ton of things I didn't know. And, I can tell you the Purums, I actually went to Frank's tanks. You might know Frank. I don't know. Maybe
Yeah.
And he had a Maxima because I'm a Maxima nut. Okay, every time I see one, I'm like, let me decide, do I want to buy it? And he had one sitting there in the tank, and you could see the Purums in the scoots or the raised lips of the shell. And I was like, wait, I'll be right back. And I ran home and came back with my camera with my macro lens, and I was taking pictures for my creature ID where I could show the pests. And then I said, Frank, do you see these things? He goes, yep. I said, you need to pick them off. And I told him to use a toothpick and just flick them off the I didn't tell him a toothbrush. And so then he did that. And then I came back a month later and took a new picture of that exact same clam. And it was wide open and happy, no pests. And he's like, thank you so much for telling me I had this problem. Because he didn't know. He just had the clam on display. And we solved it and even got before and after pictures, which was really, really cool.
Good. Yeah, and of course, if you don't know about them, you don't know. And they are tiny, and they're just kind of white, So if you're not really looking for them, you would never notice they're even there.
Right.
Until they explode.
Okay.
But that's it. Well, I'm glad you got something out of that.
No, it was fantastic. Thank you so much for coming on and staying up so late. I see Harley in the green room. He is wanting to get in. I got to get you out.
All right.
Thank you so much. I'm going to end this live stream, guys. We're going to jump to a new live stream for my conversation with Harley. We're going to talk about acrylic fabrication. James, again, thank you so much. I'm looking forward to your new book. I need to get my hands on it. Send me a link to where I can find it on Amazon. I will share it with the world to help you sell books. I'm happy to do that. And, you can post stuff on my social media if it helps get your word out on anything else you're trying to share.
Okay, I appreciate it, Mark. Thanks for having me.
All right, have a great night. Get some rest.
Yes, sir. You too.
Yeah, eventually. Bye.
All right. Bye.